On the 16th, the emperor slept at Avalon, and on the 17th at Auxerre. In this city, he was lodged in the hotels of the prefecture. Still enthusiasm, acclamations. From time to time, detachments of cuirassiers, chasseurs, and dragoons had arrived to swell the army. At Auxerre, there was a scene like that which had taken place at a time, but it was with the ecclesiastics, composed of a certain number of clergy, among whom there were one or two parish priests. It had been reported to the emperor that these clerical gentlemen mingled with their preaching political comments which bore on the events of the moment. As soon as they heard of his landing, they had spoken of him in a manner far from reverential. "What are you meddling with, Bray?" he said, after giving them to understand that he had been informed about their unchristian and ill-disposed behavior towards him. "Why must you take a hand in politics? Preach peace and harmony and confine yourself to the moral teachings of the Bible. Spiritual things ought to be the sole object, the sole text of your preaching. Far from that, it is always worldly matters with which you are concerned. Why these furious declamations which you hurl from your pulpits, from which nothing ought to be heard except words of gentleness, sweetness, and peace, conciliation, justice, and submission to the laws?" It was at Auxerre, the general prayer, who dined with the emperor, proposed making a descent on Paris with a few hundred men to surprise the Bourbons in their beds. This proposal was not agreed to. In fact, what could the emperor have done with those princes? He would have been embarrassed with them. He much preferred to leave the door open for them. What had he to fear from them? In order to expedite the march of the troops and to rest them, a certain number of boats had been collected on which the infantry were embarked. There was general joy and enthusiasm. It seemed to the soldiers as though they were going to a great fete in which they had been invited. Songs, shouts, cries of "Vive l'Empereur! Down with this, down with that!" resounded from the boats on the banks of the Yonne, to the side of which rushed the people, who in their turn did not remain silent among all these demonstrations. There was delirium in every head. The electric spark had been communicated to everybody. The story of this marvelous journey can never be read in times to come without people's feeling the same emotions as did those who witnessed it. The disaster of the Pont-sur-Yonne is well known, where one of the boats struck against one of the piers of the bridge. Poor people, poor soldiers. The emperor was profoundly affected by so sad an event which took the lives of so many brave men. During the moment of the 18th, the emperor received Marshal Ney. The marshal came up the back way. He remained for some minutes in the room, the next bedroom. His eyes were full of tears. It has been said that he had some trouble in making up his mind to come see the emperor. He was alone. The emperor did not keep him waiting long. I think it was the Grand Marshal who introduced him into the bedroom. As the door was immediately closed, I could not see how the emperor received him, nor hear the conversation, at which no one was present, so far as I know, unless it was the Grand Marshal. I think that the emperor started late from Auxerre, and I do not know where he slept the night of the 18th, 19th, or even if he slept anywhere except in his carriage. But what I do recall is that in the night of the 19th to 20th, he arrived at Marais. It was perhaps 10, 11 o'clock, even midnight. The emperor took up his quarters in the inn to await the result of the reconnaissance which was being made in the forest. It was 1:30 or 2 in the morning when he learned that the road was free. We took up our march for Fontainebleau, where we arrived at about 4. We could see in the darkness on the sides of the road the chasseurs and the grenadiers of the guard who were hurrying along at a trot. Like very tired men, they were like ghosts. If they did not arrive at the chateau at the same time as the emperor, they came in a quarter of an hour afterwards. The emperor entered by the court of the White Horse and went to his apartments, where he took a few minutes to rest, after which he made his toilet to freshen himself up. Although he had traveled a great part of the way from Grenoble in a carriage, he seemed fatigued. One might have been for less. About 6 o'clock, some regiments of lancers, chasseurs, or hussars came to form the ranks of the court of the White Horse. Each regiment was small in numbers, but its organization was pleasant to say. They had new uniforms, and each company had horses of the same color. I think that it was during the night that these corps had given themselves to the emperor. His Majesty went down, and when he appeared, cries of "Vive l'Empereur" rose from all the ranks. This review was long. As soon as the troops had passed before him, he gave the order for those regiments to march to Paris. The emperor went back to his apartments and breakfasted between 11 and 12 o'clock. He gave orders to leave. The grenadiers and chasseurs of the guard, although very tired, put their knapsacks back on their shoulders joyfully. It was the last march which they would have to make. When everything was ready, the emperor got into his carriage with the grand marshal. Post horses have been used ever since Grenoble, and they continued to be used all the way to Paris. Part of the cavalry, which had been reviewed in the morning, served as an escort. The whole army preceded or followed the emperor's cortege. We went at a slow trot in order that everybody might keep up. The cavalry, the escort, marched in single file on two sides of the road. A multitude of the inhabitants of the villages accompanied the emperor, some inside, some outside the hedge of horsemen. Every moment there came high officers and many other personages of distinction to welcome the emperor and to swell his staff, which was already of considerable size. At his son, we found carriages drawn by horses from the stables of Louis XVIII, driven by coachmen, outriders, and postilions, dressed as civilians, many of whom had formed a part of His Majesty's household. What we had seen thus far was not at all comparable with the spectacle which offered to our eyes when the emperor arrived at his son. It was nothing but carriages, saddle horses, officers of every rank, of every age, peasants, townsfolk, children, soldiers of every corps, of all ours. It was, in a word, an immense rendezvous where everything was topsy-turvy. Never could one see a greater variety in all this multitude, radiant with joy, with happiness and enthusiasm, made the air ring with cries of "Vive l'Empereur! Vive Napoleon!" All the greatest personages, both civil and military, came to greet the emperor, who received them in the most affectionate manner. The Duke of Vicenza, my dear protector, was there also. The emperor made him get into the carriage. The emperor was asked whether he wished to get into the carriage which they had prepared for him, but he refused, preferring to remain in that in which he was. 4 fresh post horses were hitched on. They set out. In spite of the hubbub around me, I could hear the emperor speaking praise of me to the grand equerry, and I was even for some time the object of the conversation. In the circumstances of my little vanity experienced a lively satisfaction and a few glances from the Duke, which I caught as I turned about from time to time, made me understand all the pleasure which he himself felt. Finally, we reached the Villejuif entrance to the city. We followed the boulevard and we reached the Invalid. We crossed the bridge of Louis XVI and we entered the court of the Tuileries by the Pont Royal gate. An immense crowd of people, which had grown at every step, had preceded or followed the cortege from the entrance to the city. Part of the population of the quarters near the boulevard had collected as the emperor passed and blocked all the outlets until we reached the gate. As there was plenty of space, we moved freely, but once we were in the court, it was no longer possible for us to advance. All the part on the side of the pavilion of Flora, near which is the ordinary entrance to the palace, was filled with so compact a mass of generals, of officers, of national guards, and a great quantity of persons of distinction, that it was impossible for me to get the carriage up to the steps. The emperor, seeing that he could go no farther, got out in the midst of the immense crowd which pressed about him, and as soon as he had set foot on the ground, they took possession of him. They carried him, so to speak, to his apartments without his foot being able to touch the steps of the staircase. It was about 9 o'clock.